after an extremely brief intermission, I just to get us get to know the team a little bit deeper, kind of in sentences, not paragraphs. How did you come to know Jesus? Right. What's one of your favorite Bible stories? And why is that story meaningful to you? And so I guess we'll just go in our same sort of arc because that worked well last time. I came to know Jesus. I was born and raised in the church and then stepped away for a while, and at one point kind of just came to a point where I said, you know what, I'm feeling a lot of anger and I need to figure things out for myself and I need to get right with God. Came back to youth group, and my youth pastor remembered my name from so many years ago, and it was just really impactful to me, and that one small act really set me back on a good path. And then going to summer camp and stuff like that with our youth ministry, I got baptized and gave my life to Jesus, and that brings me here today. One of my favorite Bible stories, this creeps into our Pastor's Choice, our Preacher's Choice series a little bit. I spoke on the books of wisdom, and I think talking about King Solomon and Job, those stories are really impactful for me because I'm a very introspective, reflective sort of person, and there are so many questions and not many answers. And it's simultaneously really frustrating, but also gives me a lot of peace to know that one of the wisest people in all of history also had a ton of questions. One of my favorite verses from the book of Ecclesiastes says that it's better to be a poor but wise youth rather than a rich and foolish king. And I really try to embody that in my life to say, hey, you know what? No matter what level of success I might perceive that I have, I need to make sure that I'm being poor and humble in spirit, and I'm here to serve. And that's what I want to do. And that's also how I approach all of these questions in life is, you know what, I'm not going to have it all figured out, but I can have peace in knowing that God does. So that's a little bit about me. I'll go ahead and pass it this way.
Yeah. So I also grew up in a Christian home, and I went to a couple different denominations of churches growing up, and so there was a little bit of confusion and deconstructing that had to take place and reconstructing. And I remember being about 12 years old and just sitting outside my aunt's house and like, all right, Jesus, if you're real, you're going to get me through my parents' divorce. Like, that was my question. And if that happens, like, I will commit my whole life to you. And so he did, or, that's what I feel. And then when I went and lived abroad for a while, I really felt like I started to understand who Jesus was, which I think was another important piece of the puzzle. Because it's one thing to grow up in a church, but I think it's another thing to really understand and grasp who Jesus is. And what does that mean for us as humans. So, and then going to favorite Bible stories, I also really love Job. I think Job, I can read that book every year or multiple times a year, and I still will end up like just weeping at the end because it just, everything feels so put into perspective. But also in the Preacher's Choice series, in the last like year and a half, I've been reading through the book of Jonah pretty consistently, and that has also had a pretty meaningful impact on my life. And as for verses in the Bible that I think have been impactful in my life, there's a verse in, I think it's Ezekiel, and it talks about like who's going to stand in the gap, who's going to bridge the gap. And so when I think of like student ministries, like who's going to stand in the gap for these students, or for these college students, or for these young people, who's going to stand in the gap for them? And so that has always propelled me towards what I feel like my God-given purpose is. So been inspiring for me in that sense. So yeah, I think that answered all the questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tag out.
Passing the baton.
Yeah, so I grew up similarly in two Christian homes, is what I like to say. My parents divorced when I was pretty young, but they both attended separate churches, and so I would bounce back and forth between a couple of churches, and then took the standard path of, all right, attend church your whole life, start volunteering in church your whole life, then eventually get on staff for church the rest of your life. But my faith really became my own when I got to choose between my mom's church and my dad's church when I was growing up. And so making that choice was really when my faith started to become personal to myself, and actually mattered at that moment, because I knew I had to make a choice between the two, because bouncing back and forth between the two, it was hard to make community. And so one of my favorite Bible stories, it's hard to pick one, but I think I'm going to cheatsy a little bit. The Old Testament stories of these people who are very human, very fallible, very broken, but God still uses them anyway. I think of Moses as a guy who dealt with anger issues, was kind of had to be abandoned as a child, had a speech impediment his whole life. Like, there's plenty of places where you can look at how Moses broke down physically, spiritually, emotionally, and God still did incredible things through his life. And toward the end of his life, he does have to suffer some of those consequences, but God still worked in really incredible ways, and that's an encouragement to me as someone who has been in church my whole life. Like, there's moments where, yeah, absolutely, I can point to my story and say, yeah, I broke down here, I broke down there, I broke down wherever, and will break down again, but God is still at work, and it's not about me. Like Moses, sure, he was one of the patriarchs of the faith, he was the guy who led Israel for a time, but it wasn't about him. It was about God, and Moses was just trying to lead God's people as God asked him to do.
Cool. I grew up in 2 non-Christian homes, and my family were not church attenders growing up, and my first introduction to church was through my grandmother's church, which was not a great experience. It was a pretty negative one, even though she really was serious about her faith, especially later in life, but that was not a great experience for me. And then my dad seemed to have a turn towards faith when I was about 13 years old, and through a divorce care ministry at a church, which was really helpful and meaningful to him, which is great. And he started bringing my brother and I, and it was at a time where I was not receptive. I was, if there is a God, he certainly hates me. That's kind of how I felt. And so I just had a lot of anger, and over the next 4 or so years just wrestling with God, like, the more I learned, the more I was like, I think this might be true, but I do not want to, like, surrender. I do not want to, like, I had problems with authority. And so I did not want to lose the wrestling match, and until I finally was like, hey, I'm losing in this, whether I want to believe it or not. I just keep getting further and further away and more lonely, I have no purpose. I keep letting people down, and I needed to surrender and ask. I think my prayer was something like, I can't change, I want to change. If you can change me, I'll follow you for the rest of my life. And God did miraculous work in my life through that. One of my favorite Bible stories is in the book of Mark, where Jesus has just come down from the mountain with a few of his disciples, and he comes across other ones who are trying to drive out an evil spirit from this guy's son, and they're not successful. And Jesus has this interaction with the man, and the guy says, "If you can heal my son," and Jesus says, "If you can. Anything is possible for the one who believes." And the guy replies with, "I believe, help me overcome my unbelief." And the reason that story is so impactful to me is that Jesus honors that faith, even though it's not perfect faith, because he heals this man's son. And for me, I've always struggled with faith and doubt. But what that story reminds me is that faith isn't about certainty. It's not about having all the answers. It's about showing up and taking the steps of faith even in the midst of doubt. Like, this guy brought his son to Jesus. Even though he was struggling to believe, he's like, I'm going to still take the steps of faith. And I'm gonna act as if I'm certain, even though I'm not certain. And that's always been really comforting to me, because I'm not always certain, but if I show up and take the steps of faith, God always shows up and meets me there.
I also grew up in a Christian home, never left church, so it's been like very lukewarm. I mean, I was always involved, but like, it's just part of my life. Like, it is what it is. I think when I was middle school, we were in a camp, and like during the prayer, I like felt something was like too warm here, like almost too hot in here. I'd never felt that before during the prayer, and I think that was like his personal, just like having like, hey, like I'm here. Like remember that, and after that I want to know Jesus more personally, and like whenever I do something I want to know why I'm doing this. So I think that was my church life was still very similar, but like in me I know like I am doing because I want to do this. And because like I lived my whole life as a Christian, I love Book of Isaiah. It just wakes me up. It's just like yelling at me. Like, I always have a tone in my head, like whenever I read it, and like whenever I need to like wake up as a Christian, I just read that book because it's just like telling me like this is not how, like this is how, right? So I love that book. But story-wise, I like 5 Loaves and 2 Fish because I also have a lot of doubts. I'm a person that like it has to make sense in me, or like at least I know for sure it is what it is, kind of like that. So then I believe kind of personality. So Jesus inviting all these people, part of his miracle that like everybody just like did. So he just gave everyone the chance, part of that story, and then everybody did it together. By the power of Jesus. Like I just wish I was there, like experience that, like be one of them, kind of like I envy them that they were there. So I love that story that, you know, like he, you know, let them have that moment, and that'll be their life story.
That's cool.
All right, well, let's see here. How did I come to know Jesus? I grew up in I'm the old man of the shop here, and I grew up in a part of the country, and at a time where everybody was pretty much a cultural Christian. I met, I think until college, I probably met one atheist in my entire life. It was just something that you just assumed that people were. And then I came out here to California, and nothing against California, but it seemed like that was the direct opposite. I didn't meet anybody who talked about their faith or anything like that. So during college, really during my 20s, my faith wasn't a very big deal to me. I grew up without a dad, so I was raised to, you know, to perform. That men do this, men do this, men do this. So it was always, I am what I do. So if I could perform at a high level, then I would be accepted, then I would be liked, then I would, you know, I would experience, you know, I guess relative happiness. And then when I became a Christian in my 30s, when I came back to my faith, it was really great to, I think I brought a lot of those habits with me. Even when I started working here, because if you needed a doer, I'm like the do guy. I am the doer. But what's been really, really great in this season of my life is realizing that everything I do needs to come out of who I am. And who I am is I'm a child of God. I'm one of his sons. And so everything should be flowing out of who I am, not what I do. So at the end of the day, I'm not what I do. I'm his son. And so my favorite part of scripture, I love me some Genesis. I love Genesis, but I think the story of Joseph, because, you know, you look at a guy who, you know, had everything and lost everything and really went through the grinder. Like, I don't even know how long he went from being sold and then becoming second next to Pharaoh. But the simple fact that it's just this beautiful redemption story, that God can do anything that he chooses to do, as long as somebody's just, I think, faithful on their end. And God can still use you no matter what. So that has always been a story that I've carried with me. That and the book of Esther I really like.
Thank you all so much for sharing. We are going to end part 2 here and jump into part 3, where we are going to make like Josh's hot sauce, and we're going to heat things up a little bit. We are going to have some hot takes that we are going to stay away from theology.
He didn't snap for him this time.
I was told not to snap. Okay, I'm banned from snapping. Why don't you go ahead and click over to that video right now?